Hi, and welcome to the archive of history. It is late evening, and the air around you has grown still and quiet. Outside your window, the world sleeps beneath the familiar rhythm of seasons you have always known. Spring follows winter, summer arrives on schedule, and autumn returns with its colors and its chill. But imagine for a moment that this rhythm, this gentle turning of the earth through warmth and cold, was not always so reliable. Imagine standing at the edge of a world encased in ice, a frozen realm that stretched unbroken across continents, a white silence that had endured for 100,000 years. And now imagine that ice beginning to melt, not quickly, not in a single catastrophic flood, but slowly, over thousands of years, drip by drip, thaw by thaw, revealing beneath its ancient weight a world utterly transformed. Tonight, you will journey back to that threshold moment in human history, to the time when the last great ice age finally released its grip on the earth, and everything changed. This is the story of the world after the ice, of the landscapes that emerged, the creatures that vanished, and the people who adapted, survived, and eventually built the civilizations we know today. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. And now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time when the very shape of the continents was being redrawn, when forests grew where glaciers had stood, and when humanity stood on the edge of a transformation that would define our species forever. You are standing on a ridge of exposed stone, high on a hillside that overlooks a valley you do not yet recognize. The wind is cold, sharper than any winter wind you have known, and it carries with it the scent of something ancient and mineral, the smell of water locked in ice for millennia now beginning to run free. Below you, stretching as far as your eyes can see, is the edge of a glacier. It is not the pristine white of fresh snow, but a broken, mottled surface of deep blue crevasses and gray dirt, stones and boulders frozen into its surface and now slowly being released. The ice is perhaps a mile thick, a wall of frozen time that has covered this land for longer than any human memory can hold. But now, in the warmth of a spring afternoon 20,000 years in the past, that ice is weeping. Streams of meltwater carve channels down its face, tumbling over its edge in small waterfalls that crash into the pools below. The sound is constant, a low roar of falling water mixed with the occasional crack and groan of the ice itself, shifting, carving, breaking apart under its own immense weight. You can feel the ground beneath your feet trembling slightly, a vibration that runs through the stone, the pulse of a world in transition. This is the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, when ice sheets covered nearly a third of the Earth's land surface. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet stretched from the Arctic Ocean down to what would one day be New York City, a frozen wall 2 miles high in places, grinding slowly southward, carving the Great Lakes from the bedrock beneath. In Europe, the Scandinavian ice sheet buried the lands that would become Sweden, Norway, and Finland, pushing down into Germany and Poland, transforming the Baltic Sea into a frozen basin locked beneath the ice. The British Isles were not islands at all, but part of a continuous landmass connected to the continent, and where the North Sea now lies, there was a vast, cold plain covered in tundra grass and crossed by herds of animals now long extinct. The world you know, the world of coastlines and river valleys, of forests and fertile plains, does not yet exist. It is still hidden, compressed beneath the weight of ice waiting to be born. But you are not alone in this frozen world. Around you, scattered across the lands not covered by ice, are small bands of people, your people. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans who have already survived tens of thousands of years in conditions that would break most living things. They are hunters, nomads who follow the great herds of megafauna across the tundra and the mammoth steppe, a cold grassland ecosystem that stretched from Western Europe across Siberia to the land bridge connecting Asia to the Americas. These are not primitive savages struggling blindly against nature. They are brilliant survivors, equipped with knowledge passed down through generations, with tools made of stone and bone and wood, with clothing sewn from hides and furs that can keep a person warm even in temperatures far below freezing. They know the movements of the stars, the patterns of the seasons, the behavior of every animal they hunt. They know which plants can be eaten and which can heal, which stones make the best spear points and where to find them. They know how to make fire even in the wind and the wet, and they know that fire is the difference between life and death on a winter night. Imagine waking in one of their shelters, a low structure built of mammoth bones and covered with hides, half buried in the earth for insulation against the cold. It is just before dawn, and the sky outside is that deep blue-black of the hour before sunrise, filled with stars brighter than you have ever seen, unobscured by moisture or dust, each one sharp and clear as a point of ice. The air inside the shelter is thick with the smell of smoke from the fire pit at the center, a small, carefully tended flame fed with pieces of bone and dried dung, for wood is scarce here in the treeless lands. Around you, wrapped in furs, are the other members of your band, perhaps 20 people in all, men, women, children, sleeping in the warmth created by their combined body heat and the smoldering fire. You rise carefully, pulling your clothing around you, layers of reindeer hide sewn with sinew, the fur turned inward against your skin. Your boots are made of thick leather, stuffed with dried grass for extra insulation, and your hands are covered in mittens made from the paws of cave bears, the fur still attached, the claws still present and useful for gripping ice or rope. Outside, the cold hits you like a physical force, a wall of air so frigid it burns your lungs with each breath. The ground is hard as stone, frozen solid, to a depth of several feet, the permafrost that never thaws even in summer. The landscape around you is vast and open, an endless expanse of rolling hills covered in yellow grass and low, tough shrubs, scattered with patches of snow that the wind has carved into strange, wave-like shapes. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, you can see the dark shapes of a mammoth herd, 20 or 30 of them moving slowly across the plain, their enormous curved tusks catching the first light of dawn. They are grazing on the tough grass, using their trunks to sweep aside the snow and expose the vegetation beneath. Around them, smaller shapes move, woolly rhinoceroses with their heavy, square heads lowered to the ground, and further off, a herd of reindeer, hundreds of them, a dark mass against the pale earth. This is the mammoth steppe, a unique ecosystem that no longer exists anywhere on Earth, a cold grassland that supported a density of large herbivores greater than the African savanna does today. Your people hunt these animals, but not with recklessness or waste. A single mammoth provides enough meat to feed your entire band for weeks, enough hide to build or repair shelters, enough bone and ivory to make tools and weapons and ornaments. The hunt is a sacred thing, planned carefully, executed with precision and courage. You have seen the men prepare, watched them sharpen their spear points, long blades of flint knapped to a razor edge and hafted to wooden shafts, practice their throwing technique, discuss the terrain and the wind and the behavior of the animal they have chosen. You have seen them approach slowly, using the land to hide their movement, separating one animal from the herd, usually a young one or an old one, something vulnerable, and then the final rush, the spears flying, the animal stumbling, and the long, respectful wait for death to come. And afterwards the careful butchering, every part used, nothing wasted, the liver and heart eaten raw while still warm, the meat cut into strips and dried or frozen for later, the bones cracked open for marrow, the hide scraped clean and prepared for tanning. This is not cruelty, this is survival. This is the relationship between humans and animals in a world where both are fighting against the cold and the scarcity and the endless, relentless winter. The megafauna of the Ice Age were unlike anything alive today. The woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, stood nearly 4 meters tall at the shoulder, covered in a thick coat of reddish-brown hair, with a layer of fat beneath the skin that could be 10 centimeters thick, insulation against temperatures that could drop to 50 degrees below zero. Their tusks, massive curved structures that could reach 4 meters in length, were used to sweep snow aside to reach the grass beneath, to dig for water, to fight rivals during the mating season. They were intelligent animals, living in herds led by the oldest and most experienced females, caring for their young for years, mourning their dead. To stand before a mammoth, to see one of these creatures alive, moving through the landscape with ponderous grace, is to understand the scale and strangeness of the world before the ice melted. And they were not alone. The woolly rhinoceros, Calodonta antiquitatis, was almost as large, a creature built like a living tank, with thick skin covered in a coat of long, shaggy hair and 2 horns on its nose, the front one sometimes reaching ½ meter in length. They were solitary, bad-tempered animals, grazing on the same tough grasses as the mammoths, but far more aggressive when threatened. A charging rhinoceros was a force of nature, unstoppable, deadly, and hunters learned to avoid them unless absolutely necessary. And then there were the predators. The cave lion, Panthera spelaire, was larger than any lion alive today, powerfully built, with a short mane and a coat adapted to the cold. They hunted in prides, taking down young mammoths or reindeer or bison, and their roar could be heard echoing across the steppe for miles. The cave hyena, the dire wolf, the short-faced bear, an animal so massive it could stand 3 meters tall on its hind legs. All of these creatures moved through the Ice Age landscape, part of an ecosystem balanced on the edge of survival, adapted to a world of cold and scarcity and the slow, grinding presence of the ice. But your people, the humans who lived through this, were perhaps the most remarkable creatures of all. You had no thick fur, no layer of blubber, no claws or fangs to speak of. What you had was intelligence, cooperation, and the ability to adapt. You learned to make fire, not just to find it, but to create it, striking sparks from flint and iron pyrite, nurturing those sparks into flame with dried grass and fungus, feeding the flame with whatever would burn. You learned to make shelters, digging into the earth for insulation, using mammoth bones as structural supports where wood was not available, covering the framework with hides sewn tightly together to keep out the wind. You learned to make clothing that could keep you alive in temperatures no naked human could survive, layering hides and furs, stitching them with bone needles and sinew thread, inventing boots and gloves and hoods. You learned to preserve food, freezing meat in the permafrost, drying it in the sun and wind, storing it against the long winter when hunting was impossible. And you learned to create beauty, even in this harsh world. You carved figurines from mammoth ivory, small, careful representations of animals and women, objects that served some purpose we can only guess at, ritual or magic or simple decoration. You painted the walls of caves with images of the animals you hunted, bison and horses and aurochs, rendered with astonishing skill and accuracy, using pigments made from ochre and charcoal and manganese, mixed with animal fat to make them adhere to the stone. These paintings, found in caves across Europe, in Lascaux and Chauvet and Altamira, are among the oldest art ever created, evidence of minds that could think symbolically, that could represent the world in images, that could imagine and remember and pass knowledge down through generations. You were human, fully human, capable of everything humans would later achieve, and you lived in a world of ice and cold and darkness, and you survived. The sky above you is enormous, a dome of crystalline clarity that stretches from horizon to horizon. During the day, the sun traces a low arc across the southern sky, never rising very high, casting long shadows that make the landscape seem even vaster and more empty. At night, the stars are your companions, familiar patterns that you have learned to read, constellations that tell you when to expect the reindeer migrations, when the salmon will run in the rivers, when the brief summer will come. The moon waxes and wanes, marking the months, and sometimes in the deep winter, the northern lights appear, curtains of green and purple and red shimmering across the sky, silent and mysterious and beautiful. Your people have stories about the lights, explanations for their presence, tales of spirits and ancestors dancing in the sky, and these stories are part of your culture, part of what makes you human. The cold is always there, a constant presence, something you must always be aware of. Frostbite can take fingers and toes in minutes if you are not careful, and hypothermia can kill in hours. You have seen people die from the cold, seen them grow confused and sluggish, seen them lie down in the snow and never rise again. You have learned to watch for the signs, the shivering that eventually stops, the slurred speech, the strange desire to remove your clothing even as you freeze. You have learned to prevent it, to keep moving, to stay dry, to seek shelter when the wind rises and the temperature drops. The cold shapes everything you do, every decision you make, every action you take. It is the defining fact of your existence, the great enemy that must be fought every day, every hour, and yet it is also familiar, almost comforting in its constancy. This is your world, and you know no other. But now, something is changing. You have noticed it over the course of your lifetime. Subtle shifts that are hard to name but impossible to ignore. The summers seem slightly warmer, the ice on the rivers breaking up a little earlier each spring, the snow melting a little faster each year. The elders speak of it sometimes, noting that things are not quite as they were when they were young, that the mammoths seem to be moving further north, that new plants are appearing in places that were once bare. These changes are gradual, almost imperceptible from year to year, but over generations they accumulate, and the world begins to transform. The Earth's climate is driven by forces far larger than anything happening on its surface. By the slow, predictable variations in the planet's orbit around the sun, by the tilt of its axis, by the wobble of that axis like a spinning top slowly winding down. These are called Milankovitch cycles, named for the Serbian scientist who would describe them many thousands of years in your future, and they operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years, gradually shifting the amount and distribution of solar radiation the Earth receives. During the last glacial maximum, these cycles had aligned to minimize the warmth reaching the northern hemisphere during summer, allowing ice to accumulate year after year, building the great ice sheets that covered the continents. But now, slowly, the cycles are shifting. The Earth's axis is tilting slightly more toward the Sun during the northern summer. The planet's orbit is becoming slightly less elliptical, and these small changes are beginning to tip the balance. More sunlight is reaching the ice sheets during the summer months. More heat is being absorbed, and for the first time in 100,000 years, the ice is melting faster than it is accumulating. The first signs of the thaw are visible at the edges of the glaciers themselves. You have stood at these edges many times over the years, and you have watched them change. The ice is retreating, not smoothly, but in fits and starts, calving off enormous chunks that crash into the meltwater pools below, sending up spray and creating waves that ripple outward. The glaciers are not solid, monolithic things, but living rivers of ice, constantly moving, constantly changing, grinding slowly forward or slowly backward, depending on the balance between snow accumulating at their tops and ice melting at their edges. And now, for the first time in living memory, they are moving backward. The edge that was here a generation ago is now a mile further north, and the land it once covered is being revealed. This newly exposed land is strange and raw, scoured clean by the ice, the bedrock polished smooth and marked with long, parallel scratches, where stones frozen in the base of the glacier dragged across the surface. There is no soil, no plants, just bare rock and gravel and the occasional boulder, massive and alone, carried here by the ice from somewhere far to the north, and deposited when the ice finally melted. These are called erratics, and they sit like monuments to the power of the glacier, stones the size of houses perched on hillsides where they could never have naturally occurred. The land smells different here, wet and mineral, the scent of stone that has not felt sunlight in 100,000 years, and the silence is profound, broken only by the sound of running water and the occasional crack of more ice breaking away. But the barren land does not stay barren for long. Within a few years, the first hardy plants begin to appear, small, tough species that can survive in the thin, nutrient-poor soil that is beginning to form from the ground-up rock and the dust blown in by the wind. Mosses and lichens come first, tiny, almost invisible, colonizing the bare stone, beginning the slow process of breaking it down, creating the foundation for other plants to follow. Then come grasses, low and sparse at first, but spreading quickly, their roots binding the soil, their seeds carried by the wind and by animals from the warmer lands to the south. And with the grass come the animals, slowly at first, then in greater numbers, herbivores spreading north to take advantage of the new grazing lands, and behind them, the predators that follow the herds. You are watching the birth of a new landscape, a transformation happening on a timescale that is both geological and immediate. The ice is not melting in a single catastrophic event, but slowly over centuries and millennia, and each generation sees the world slightly different from the one before. Your grandparents lived in a world where the ice reached to the horizon, where the winters were longer and harsher, where certain plants and animals did not exist. Your parents lived in a world where the ice had begun to retreat, where the summers were slightly warmer, where new opportunities for hunting and gathering were opening up. And you live in a world where the change is accelerating, where the old ways are no longer sufficient, where adaptation is not just advantageous but necessary for survival. The meltwater from the glaciers is creating new rivers, vast torrents of water that carve deep valleys through the landscape, carrying silt and gravel and boulders downstream, depositing them in great fans where the rivers slow and spread out across the plains. These rivers are not like the gentle streams you might know, but powerful, unpredictable forces, changing course from season to season, sometimes flooding across entire valleys, creating temporary lakes that last for years before draining away. The land is being reshaped, valleys deepened, hills eroded, new lakes forming in the depressions left by the ice. And all of this is happening slowly, imperceptibly from day to day, but undeniably over the course of a lifetime. The climate itself is becoming more variable, more unpredictable. The deep, stable cold of the full glacial period is giving way to a climate in transition, with warmer summers and milder winters, but also with greater extremes, sudden storms, periods of intense rainfall, and unexpected cold snaps. The jet stream, the high-altitude river of wind that circles the planet, is shifting position as the temperature gradient between the ice-covered north and the warmer south changes. This shifting creates instability, wild swings in weather patterns, and your people must learn to adapt to conditions that change not just from season to season but from year to year. The megafauna are responding to these changes as well, but not all in the same way. The mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses, creatures supremely adapted to the cold, dry conditions of the mammoth steppe, are finding their habitat shrinking. As the climate warms, the grasslands are being replaced by shrubs and eventually by forests, environments less suitable for these large, grazing animals. They begin to move north, following the retreating cold, following the familiar vegetation, and the herds that once roamed across what would become France and Germany and Poland are now confined to increasingly smaller areas in the far north. The reindeer, more adaptable, follow the same pattern, migrating north with the seasons, and your people follow them, for the reindeer are life itself, providing meat and hide and bone and antler, everything needed for survival. But other animals are thriving in the new conditions. Species adapted to warmer climates are spreading north from their refuges in the south, filling the ecological niches being vacated by the cold-adapted megafauna. Aurochs, massive wild cattle, appear in greater numbers, grazing on the new grasslands and the edges of the expanding forests. Red deer and roe deer, elk and wild boar, all begin to expand their ranges, and with them come new predators, brown bears and wolves and lynx, replacing the cave lions and hyenas that are slowly disappearing. The world is not dying but transforming, one ecosystem giving way to another, and those species that can adapt will survive, while those that cannot will vanish. You are living through what archaeologists will one day call the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age, a time of transition between the old Stone Age of the mammoth hunters and the new Stone Age of the first farmers. It is a time of innovation and adaptation, when the old ways must change or be lost. Your people are developing new technologies, new strategies, new ways of thinking about the world and their place in it. The most important of these innovations is a weapon that will change hunting forever: the bow and arrow. The bow is not a simple tool. It requires knowledge of wood and its properties, the ability to select the right piece, to shape it, to string it with sinew or plant fiber, to create something with flexibility and strength, and the ability to store energy when drawn and release it in a sudden violent snap. The arrows are even more complex, requiring straight shafts, flights made from feathers to stabilize their path through the air, and points made from stone or bone, small and sharp and carefully shaped. These points, called microliths, are tiny compared to the large spear points of the Ice Age hunters, often no bigger than a fingernail. But when hafted to an arrow shaft and fired from a bow, they can kill at distances the old hunters could never have achieved. A skilled archer can hit a target from 100 paces, can hunt alone without the need for a group of spear-wielding hunters, can take down birds in flight or fish in shallow water. The bow and arrow represent a fundamental shift in human capability, a technological leap that opens up new possibilities and new ways of living. With the bow comes a change in social structure, or where mammoth hunting required cooperation, coordination, large groups of hunters working together to bring down a single massive animal. Bow hunting can be done alone or in small groups. A single hunter with a bow can feed himself and his family without depending on the collective effort of the entire band. This independence changes relationships, changes the way people think about property and obligation and leadership. The old Ice Age bands, tightly knit groups where everyone depended on everyone else, begin to fragment into smaller, more autonomous family units. The social world is becoming more complex, more individualized, and with that complexity comes both opportunity and conflict. Fishing, too, is becoming more important. As the ice melts, new rivers and lakes are forming, filled with salmon and trout and pike, and your people are learning to exploit these resources with increasing sophistication. You have seen the creation of fish traps, elaborate structures of woven branches set in the rivers to catch fish as they migrate upstream to spawn. You have seen the development of fishing spears, multi-pronged weapons designed to impale fish in shallow water, and the invention of fish hooks, small, carefully carved pieces of bone shaped to catch in the mouth of a fish and hold it fast. Fishing provides a reliable, predictable source of protein, less dangerous than hunting, less dependent on the luck of finding game, and settlements begin to cluster near productive fishing spots, places where food can be harvested consistently year after year. These settlements are different from the temporary camps of the Ice Age hunters. They are becoming more permanent, more substantial, with structures that are built to last for years rather than a single season. You have helped build such places, digging post holes deep into the ground, erecting frames of timber, covering them with bark or hides or even sod, creating homes that can withstand the storms of winter and provide shelter for entire families. Around these homes you see the accumulation of possessions, things that cannot easily be carried from place to place: pottery for storing food and water, grinding stones for processing plant materials, tools and weapons and materials for making more tools and weapons. The concept of home is changing from a place you temporarily occupy to a place you return to, a fixed point in the landscape that belongs to you and your family, and this shift will have profound implications for the future of humanity. The diet is diversifying as well. Where the Ice Age hunters depended heavily on meat from large game, you now eat a much wider variety of foods. The warming climate is bringing new plants, berries and nuts and roots that can be gathered and eaten or stored for winter. Hazelnuts in particular become a staple, collected in enormous quantities in the autumn when they fall from the trees, roasted over fires to make them easier to store, and eaten throughout the year as a portable, high-energy food. You gather wild grains, the ancestors of wheat and barley, grinding them into flour that can be mixed with water and cooked into a kind of flatbread. You dig for roots and tubers, collect birds' eggs, harvest shellfish from the coasts, all part of a pattern of exploitation that takes advantage of every available resource. This diversification of diet is not just about abundance, but about risk management. A hunter who depends entirely on mammoths is vulnerable. If the mammoths disappear, he starves. But a hunter-gatherer who exploits 20 different food sources is resilient. If one resource fails, 19 others remain. And as the climate continues to change, as the megafauna continue to decline, this resilience becomes increasingly important. Your people are learning to be generalists, to adapt to whatever the environment provides, and this adaptability is what will allow them to survive the transformations to come. The spiritual world is changing as well. The great cave paintings, the deep underground sanctuaries where the Ice Age hunters performed their rituals, are being abandoned. The last paintings at Lascaux are created around 12,000 years ago, and after that, the tradition fades. The focus of spiritual attention is shifting from the animals themselves to the forces of nature, to the sun and the moon and the changing seasons, to the spirits of the rivers and the forests that are now part of daily life. You participate in new rituals, ceremonies held at the solstices and equinoxes, gatherings where multiple bands come together to trade and share information and find marriage partners and perform the rites that bind your people together. These gatherings are held at special places, natural landmarks or places marked by standing stones, the first hints of the megalithic monuments that will later dot the landscape of Europe. The shamans, the spiritual leaders of your people, are figures of great power and mystery. They are healers and seers, mediators between the human world and the spirit world, able to enter trance states through drumming and chanting and the consumption of certain plants. They wear elaborate costumes, headdresses made from antlers or bird skulls, cloaks of feathers, and they carry staffs carved with symbols that have meaning known only to them. They perform rituals to ensure good hunting, to heal the sick, to guide the souls of the dead to the afterlife. They are the keepers of knowledge, the preservers of tradition, and their authority is based not on physical strength, but on their perceived ability to communicate with the unseen forces that control the world. Death is handled with increasing care and ceremony. Where the Ice Age hunters sometimes left their dead on the surface to be scavenged by animals, you now bury your dead, placing them in graves dug into the earth, sometimes with grave goods, tools and ornaments and food for the journey to the afterlife. Some graves are elaborate, the bodies sprinkled with red ochre, a mineral pigment that symbolizes blood and life, positioned carefully with their heads facing a particular direction, surrounded by objects that held meaning in life. These burials suggest a growing belief in an afterlife, in the continuity of the person beyond death, and they represent some of the earliest evidence of complex religious thought. As the centuries pass, the changes accelerate. The ice continues to retreat. The climate continues to warm and the landscape is utterly transformed. Forests are spreading rapidly across what was once open tundra, first birch and pine, hardy pioneers that can tolerate poor soil, and then, as the soil deepens and enriches, oak and elm and ash, massive trees that create dense canopies and shade out the grasses below. The mammoth steppe is disappearing, replaced by the great northern forests that will one day be called the taiga and the temperate woodlands of Europe. And with the forests come new challenges, for hunting in dense woodland is very different from hunting on the open plain. The old techniques no longer work, the animals are different, the visibility is limited, and your people must adapt again, learning to move quietly through the underbrush, to track animals through the forest, to set snares and traps, and to use the bow to its full advantage in close quarters. The transformation is not uniform across the world. In some places, the ice is retreating rapidly. In others, it lingers for centuries. In some regions, forests spring up almost overnight in geological terms. In others, the transition from tundra to grassland to forest takes thousands of years. The climate is not warming steadily, but in pulses, periods of rapid warming followed by periods of stability or even brief returns to colder conditions. This variability creates a patchwork of environments, and human populations, always small and scattered, respond to these local conditions in different ways, developing different technologies, different social structures, different spiritual beliefs. The human world is diversifying, fragmenting into distinct cultures, each adapted to its particular environment, each solving the problems of survival in its own way. But the most dramatic transformation is happening along the coasts, where the rising sea is redrawing the map of the world. During the last glacial maximum, so much water was locked up in the ice sheets that global sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than they are today. Coastlines extended far out beyond where they are now, and vast areas of land that are now underwater were dry, habitable, and in some cases thriving with life. These were not barren wastelands, but productive landscapes, river valleys and grasslands and forests, home to animals and the people who hunted them. And as the ice melts, as the water locked in the glaciers for 100,000 years begins to flow back into the oceans, these lands are slowly drowned. Imagine standing on a beach, somewhere in what will one day be called the North Sea. It is not a sea at all, but a vast, low-lying plain crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes, a landscape not unlike the tundra of northern Canada or Siberia. Your people call this land Doggerland, though they do not call it anything in particular, for it is simply the world as they know it, the place where they have always lived. The rivers here are rich with fish, salmon and sturgeon that swim upstream from the ocean to spawn, and your people have built weirs, structures of wooden stakes and woven branches, that trap the fish and allow them to be harvested in great numbers. The land is home to herds of aurochs and deer, and in the marshes at the mouths of the rivers, flocks of migratory birds gather in the spring and autumn, so many that the sky darkens when they take flight. This is a rich land, a productive land, and your people have thrived here for generations. But the sea is rising. Not quickly, not in a way that would be obvious from day to day or even year to year, but steadily, relentlessly, over the course of centuries. The coastline is moving inland. The beaches are disappearing, the river mouths are widening into estuaries, and the marshlands are growing more extensive, more difficult to traverse. Your grandparents speak of places that are now underwater, camps that were once far inland, but are now accessible only at low tide, forests that are now dead, grey, skeletal trees standing in shallow water, their roots drowned by the rising salt. The change is slow, but it is real, and it is irreversible. The people of Doggerland are adapting to the rising waters, learning to live with the sea rather than simply beside it. They are building boats, simple dugout canoes made from tree trunks, hollowed out with fire and stone tools, capable of carrying a few people and their possessions across rivers and along the coast. They are learning to fish from boats, to set nets and lines in deeper water, to navigate by the stars and the sun and the patterns of the waves. The sea is becoming not just a barrier but a resource, a source of food and a highway for travel and trade. But there are dangers as well. Storms are more frequent now, fierce weather systems that blow in from the Atlantic, bringing heavy rain and high winds and storm surges that can raise the level of the sea by several meters in a matter of hours. Your people have learned to read the signs, the color of the sky, the behavior of the birds, the feel of the wind, and when a storm is coming, they move to higher ground, taking their boats and their most valuable possessions with them. But sometimes the storms come without warning, and people are caught in the open, drowned or swept away, their bodies never found. The sea is generous but also cruel, and it demands respect. As the centuries pass, the drowning of Doggerland accelerates. The land is being squeezed from all sides, the sea rising from the west and south, the rivers widening and merging, the low-lying areas turning into permanent lakes and lagoons. The higher ground, the ridges and hills that once provided hunting territory, are becoming islands, isolated from each other, connected only by boat. The great herds of aurochs and deer, unable to adapt to the shrinking land, are declining in number, and hunting becomes more difficult, more dangerous, more dependent on luck. The people of Doggerland are living in a world that is disappearing beneath them, and they know it. The stories of the elders speak of a time when the land stretched far to the west, when you could walk for days without seeing the sea. But those times are gone, and they are not coming back. Around 8,000 years ago, the final catastrophe comes. A massive landslide occurs off the coast of what will one day be Norway, an underwater avalanche triggered by an earthquake, sending a tsunami roaring south across the North Sea. The wave, perhaps 20 meters high, crashes into the low-lying lands of Doggerland, sweeping away everything in its path, drowning entire settlements, killing thousands of people in a matter of minutes. The survivors, those who were on higher ground or who managed to reach their boats in time, are left in a world utterly changed. The land they knew is gone, replaced by a shallow sea dotted with islands, and those islands are shrinking with each passing year. Some groups abandon the islands and move to the higher lands to the east and west, to what will become Britain and the European mainland. Others cling to the remaining land, living as islanders, dependent on the sea for their survival, until eventually, even those last islands disappear beneath the waves. Doggerland is not unique. All around the world, lands are being drowned as the ice melts and the sea rises. In Southeast Asia, a vast landmass called Sunderland, connecting what are now the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, is slowly submerged, turning mountains into islands and river valleys into straits and seas. In Australia, the land bridge connecting Tasmania to the mainland is severed, isolating the people of Tasmania for 10,000 years, cutting them off from the innovations and developments happening on the continent to the north. In North America, the land bridge called Beringia, connecting Siberia to Alaska, is flooded, separating the Americas from Asia and creating the Bering Strait. The world is being fragmented, continents are becoming islands, and populations that were once connected are now isolated. Their histories diverging, their cultures developing independently. The human stories lost beneath these rising seas are countless. How many settlements were abandoned? How many migrations were forced? How many people drowned in storms or tsunamis? We will never know. The archaeological evidence is buried under hundreds of feet of water, on continental shelves now far offshore, in places too deep and too difficult to excavate. But sometimes, by chance, the sea gives up its secrets. Fishermen trawling the bottom of the North Sea sometimes bring up bones, mammoth tusks and reindeer antlers, and the occasional human artifact, stone tools or carved bone, evidence of the world that once existed there. And divers exploring the coasts of the Mediterranean or the Black Sea or the Persian Gulf sometimes find the ruins of ancient settlements, stone walls and hearths and pottery, now 20 or 30 meters below the surface, drowned when the sea rose at the end of the Ice Age. These drowned lands have left their mark on human memory. Across the world, cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years tell remarkably similar stories, myths and legends of a great flood. A time when the sea rose and drowned the world, when only a few survivors escaped to higher ground or on boats. The flood story in the Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, the flood myths of the Greeks and the Hindus and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, all of these may preserve some distant memory of the real floods that occurred as the Ice Age ended, transformed over countless retellings into stories of divine punishment and miraculous survival. The sea that rose at the end of the Ice Age was not a punishment from the gods, but a consequence of climate change. But to the people who experienced it, who watched their world slowly disappear beneath the waves, the distinction would have meant little. While the coasts of Europe and Asia were being drowned, another extraordinary transformation was taking place far to the south, in a region that would seem to be the least likely place for abundance. Imagine now that you are standing not on the edge of a melting glacier or a rising sea, but in the heart of the Sahara Desert, except that it is not a desert at all. You are standing in a grassland, a savanna dotted with acacia trees and low thorny shrubs, under a sky that is heavy with moisture, threatening rain. Around you the land stretches green and alive, crossed by rivers that flow year-round, their banks lined with reeds and papyrus, their waters teeming with fish and hippopotamuses and crocodiles. This is the Green Sahara, and it exists because of the same climate changes that are melting the ice in the north, a shift in the Earth's orbital parameters that has brought the monsoon rains north, far beyond their modern limits. During the last glacial maximum, the Sahara was even drier than it is today, a wasteland of sand and rock where nothing could live. But as the climate warmed and the ice retreated, the atmospheric circulation patterns that govern rainfall in Africa shifted dramatically. The intertropical convergence zone, the band of heavy rainfall that circles the Earth near the equator, moved north, and with it came the monsoon rains, reliable, heavy downpours that fell every summer, filling the dry lake beds and creating new rivers and transforming the desert into a landscape capable of supporting life. This period, known to scientists as the African humid period, lasted from roughly 11,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, and during those 6,000 years, the Sahara was a garden. You are part of a community that has moved into this newly habitable land, following the animals that migrated north as the grasslands expanded. Your people are pastoralists, herders who have domesticated cattle, learning to control and breed them, to milk them, and to use their hides and their bones. These cattle are descended from the wild aurochs that once roamed across Africa, but through generations of careful selection, they have been transformed into animals that are more docile, more productive, more suited to living alongside humans. Your wealth is measured in cattle, and your life revolves around their needs, moving from pasture to pasture, following the rains, protecting the herds from lions and hyenas and human raiders. The cattle provide milk and blood, taken from the living animals without killing them, mixed together and consumed as a rich, nutritious drink. They provide meat, though the animals are slaughtered sparingly, only for special occasions or when the herd grows too large to manage. And they provide status, for a man with many cattle is a man of power and influence, able to negotiate marriages, to support dependents, to command respect. The landscape around you is dotted with lakes, some small and seasonal, drying up in the dry season and refilling with the rains, others large and permanent, vast bodies of fresh water that would astonish anyone who knows the Sahara of later times. Lake Chad, which in the modern era is a shallow, shrinking remnant, is now enormous, covering an area larger than the Caspian Sea, its shores lined with fishing villages and pastoralist camps. Lake Megafauna in what will one day be Libya is another huge body of water, connected to a network of smaller lakes and rivers, a landscape of marshes and reed beds and open water that extends for hundreds of miles. These lakes are rich with life, fish and waterfowl, and the animals that come to drink, and your people exploit these resources with increasing skill, using nets and traps and spears, building boats from bundles of reeds to navigate the shallow waters. The rock art of the Green Sahara tells the story of this time in vivid detail. On the walls of caves and rock shelters, in places that are now in the middle of the desert, far from any water, ancient artists painted and carved images of the world they knew. They painted cattle, hundreds of them, carefully depicted with their distinctive long horns and patterned hides, being herded by people carrying staffs and whips. They painted giraffes and elephants and rhinoceroses, animals that need abundant vegetation and water to survive, evidence that such resources were available here. They painted people swimming, their bodies sleek and graceful in the water, and people in boats rowing or poling their way across lakes and rivers. The art is beautiful and detailed, created with ochre and charcoal and white clay, and it preserves a vision of the Sahara that is almost impossible to reconcile with the barren wasteland it would become. Your people are also beginning to experiment with plant cultivation. In the fertile soils along the riverbanks, where the annual floods leave behind layers of rich silt, you plant seeds of wild grasses and watch them grow, harvesting the grain when it ripens, saving some for the next planting season. These are the first tentative steps toward agriculture in Africa, independent of the developments happening at the same time in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East. You are not yet dependent on farming. The herds and the fishing and the gathered wild plants provide more than enough food, but the knowledge is there, the understanding that plants can be managed and encouraged, and this knowledge will prove crucial in the centuries to come. The Green Sahara is not empty of people beyond your own group, Across this vast grassland, other communities are scattered, some pastoralists like you, others still living as hunter-gatherers, exploiting the abundant wildlife without domesticated animals. There is contact between these groups, trade in goods and ideas, marriages that link distant communities, and sometimes conflict, disputes over access to water or grazing land that can escalate into violence. But the land is rich enough that there is room for everyone, and the population, though growing, is still small enough that the resources seem inexhaustible. But nothing lasts forever. Around 6,000 years ago, the rains begin to fail. The shift is gradual at first. A few years of lighter rainfall, the lakes shrinking slightly, the grass growing less lush. But then the trend continues, year after year, decade after decade, and it becomes clear that something fundamental is changing. The monsoon is retreating south, back toward its modern position, and the Sahara is drying out. The rivers slow to a trickle and then stop flowing entirely, their beds becoming dry wadis, channels of sand and gravel that only carry water after the rare rainstorm. The lakes evaporate, their shorelines retreating, leaving behind broad plains of cracked mud and salt deposits. The grass withers and dies, the trees grow more sparse, and the desert, the true desert of sand and rock and relentless sun, begins to reclaim the land. Your people try to adapt. You move more frequently, following the shrinking pastures, congregating around the remaining sources of water, competing with other groups for access to the dwindling resources. The herds suffer, weakened by hunger and thirst, more vulnerable to disease and predators. People suffer too, and the old and the very young are the first to succumb. The stories of your elders speak of a time when the land was green and abundant, when there was water everywhere and the herds were fat and healthy. But those times are fading into legend, and the younger generation knows only the struggle and the scarcity. Gradually, inexorably, the Sahara empties. Some groups move south, following the rains, adapting to the forests and savannas of sub-Saharan Africa. Others move north, toward the Mediterranean coast, where rainfall is more reliable. But the majority move east, toward the one river that still flows, the Nile. The Nile is fed by the mountains of Ethiopia and the Great Lakes of equatorial Africa, and its flow is not dependent on the local rainfall. Even as the Sahara dries up, the Nile continues to flood every year, its waters bringing life to the narrow valley that cuts through the desert. And along the banks of that river, the refugees from the dying Sahara begin to settle, bringing with them their cattle and their knowledge of plants and their traditions and their stories. These people, concentrated along the Nile, will become the foundation of one of the world's first great civilizations, but that is a story for later. For now, they are simply survivors, people displaced by climate change, making a new life in a new land. The transformation of the Sahara from grassland to desert is one of the most dramatic climate changes of the post-Ice Age world, a shift as profound as the melting of the glaciers, and it serves as a reminder that the climate is never stable, that the world is always changing, and that human societies must always adapt or perish. The green Sahara is gone, buried beneath the sand, but its memory persists in the rock art and the ancient lake beds and the stories passed down through generations, a testament to a time when the desert bloomed. While the Sahara was blooming and then dying, another transformation was taking place in a crescent-shaped region of the Near East, a transformation that would prove to be the most important development in human history. Imagine now that you are standing in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, in the region that will one day be called the Fertile Crescent, a band of land that stretches from the Mediterranean coast through modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. The landscape here is neither desert nor forest, but a mosaic of grasslands and oak woodlands, watered by winter rains and crossed by rivers that flow year-round from the mountains. The climate in the millennia following the end of the Ice Age is mild and wet, perfect for the growth of wild cereals, and the hillsides are covered with stands of wild wheat and barley, grasses with large nutritious seeds that can be harvested and eaten. Your people, the Natufians, are hunter-gatherers, but you are unlike the mobile bands of the Ice Age. You live in permanent villages, clusters of round stone houses built into the hillsides, occupied year-round by communities of several hundred people. This is possible because the resources here are so abundant and so reliable that there is no need to move. The wild cereals ripen every spring and can be harvested in enormous quantities, enough to feed the entire village for months. Gazelles migrate through the region in predictable patterns, and hunting them is a communal activity. Whole herds driven into traps or surrounded and killed with bows and spears. The rivers provide fish, the forests provide nuts and fruits, and the overall productivity of the land is so high that for the first time in human history, people can settle down and stay in one place. But sedentism, living in permanent settlements, brings challenges that mobile hunter-gatherers never faced. When you live in one place, you must deal with waste, human refuse and garbage that accumulates and attracts pests and disease. You must manage social relationships in a way that is different from small mobile bands where people who don't get along can simply move away. You must develop new forms of authority, new ways of making decisions and resolving conflicts, because the old consensus-based systems that worked for groups of 20 or 30 people do not scale to villages of 200 or 300. And you must begin to think about property, about who owns what, because the house you build is not something you can easily carry with you, and the grain you store is valuable and worth defending. The Natufian villages are the first permanent human settlements in the Near East, and they represent a crucial step on the path to civilization. But they are not yet farming. The grain you harvest is wild, the animals you hunt are wild, and your way of life, while sedentary, is still based on gathering the resources that nature provides. The transition to true agriculture, to the deliberate cultivation and domestication of plants and animals, happens gradually, over centuries, driven not by some sudden insight, but by a slow accumulation of knowledge and necessity. The key to domestication is selection. Every plant has variation. Some seeds are larger, some plants are more productive, some are easier to harvest because the seed heads do not shatter and scatter their seeds when touched. Wild wheat and barley have seed heads that shatter easily, an adaptation that allows them to spread their seeds widely. But for a human trying to harvest the grain, this is a problem, because much of the crop is lost before it can be collected. But if you preferentially harvest the plants whose seed heads do not shatter, and if you plant those seeds the following year, you are, without realizing it, selecting for a trait that makes the plant more useful to humans and less able to survive in the wild. Over generations, this selection transforms the wild plant into a domestic one, dependent on humans for its propagation, larger and more productive, but unable to compete without human intervention. The same process occurs with animals. Wild sheep and goats are skittish and aggressive, difficult to control, but if you capture the young and raise them, and if you selectively breed the ones that are more docile and more productive, you gradually create a domestic animal. Domestic sheep produce more wool, domestic goats give more milk, and both are easier to manage than their wild ancestors. The domestication of plants and animals is not a single event but a process that unfolds over thousands of years. A co-evolution of humans and the species they depend on, each shaping the other in ways that are often subtle but ultimately profound. The archaeological site of Göbekli Tepe, located in what is now southeastern Turkey, offers a tantalizing glimpse into the spiritual world of the people who were on the cusp of this agricultural revolution. Göbekli Tepe is a temple, or rather a complex of temples, massive circular structures made of carefully shaped limestone pillars, some weighing 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, scorpions, snakes, foxes, wild boar and birds. The pillars are arranged in circles, and at the center of each circle are two larger pillars, sometimes with carved human-like features, arms and hands and loincloths, suggesting that they represent stylized human figures or gods. The site dates to around 11,000 years ago, making it older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years, and astonishingly, it was built before agriculture, by hunter-gatherers, or people who were just beginning to experiment with cultivation. The construction of Göbekli Tepe would have required the labor of hundreds of people working together for years or even decades, quarrying the stone, transporting it to the site, carving it, erecting it. This level of organization and cooperation is unprecedented for hunter-gatherers, and it suggests that the people who built Göbekli Tepe had a complex social structure, a hierarchy of authority, and a shared belief system that could motivate such an enormous collective effort. Some archaeologists believe that the construction of sites like Göbekli Tepe actually drove the development of agriculture, that the need to feed the workers required the intensification of food production, leading to the cultivation of wild cereals and the domestication of animals. Whether this is true or not, Göbekli Tepe stands as evidence that the people of the Fertile Crescent were capable of remarkable achievements even before they became farmers. Around 10,000 years ago, the transition to agriculture is complete. Villages in the Levant and the Zagros foothills are now cultivating wheat and barley, planting seeds in prepared fields, weeding and watering the crops, harvesting the grain and storing it in granaries. They are herding goats and sheep, managing the size and composition of the flocks, protecting them from predators, milking them and slaughtering them for meat. The wild ancestors of these plants and animals still exist in the surrounding landscape, but the domestic varieties are distinct, genetically altered by centuries of selection, more productive but also more dependent on human care. The first true farming villages appear. Jericho in the Jordan Valley, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the world, is a town of circular mud brick houses surrounded by a massive stone wall and tower. Built around 9,500 years ago for reasons that are still debated, defense against enemies or protection from floods, or simply a communal project to bind the community together. Çatalhöyük in central Turkey is another early farming settlement, a town of perhaps 8,000 people at its peak, living in tightly packed rectangular houses with no streets. The houses built wall to wall and entered through holes in the roof. Inside these houses, the dead are buried beneath the floors, and the walls are decorated with painted murals and reliefs of animals and geometric patterns, evidence of a rich symbolic and spiritual life. Life in these early farming villages is hard. The archaeological evidence shows that farmers were generally less healthy than hunter-gatherers, with higher rates of dental disease from eating grain, more skeletal stress from the repetitive labor of grinding grain and tilling fields, and more infectious disease from living in close quarters with animals and other people. The diet is less varied, more dependent on a few staple crops, and famines are more common, because if the harvest fails, there is no fallback. But despite these costs, farming spreads, because it allows for higher population densities, because it creates surplus that can be stored and traded, and because once a community commits to farming, it becomes difficult to go back. The knowledge of how to live as hunter-gatherers is gradually lost, and the population grows beyond what the wild resources could support. The Neolithic Revolution, as this transition to farming is called, is not a revolution in the sense of being sudden or violent, but it is revolutionary in its consequences. Farming creates food surplus, and surplus creates the possibility of specialization, of people who do not have to spend all their time procuring food and can instead become craftsmen or traders or priests. It creates population growth, because farming communities can support more children than hunter-gatherers. It creates property and wealth inequality, because some people end up with better land or larger herds, and these inequalities can be passed down to children, creating hereditary social classes. It creates conflict, because farmland is valuable and worth fighting over, and the evidence from Neolithic sites includes fortifications and weapons and skeletons with healed injuries from violence. And ultimately, farming creates civilization, because the surplus it produces allows for the development of cities, of writing, of organized religion and government, and all the other institutions that define complex societies. But the Neolithic Revolution does not happen everywhere at once. It begins in the Fertile Crescent and then spreads, slowly, carried by migrating farmers, or adopted by local hunter-gatherers who see the advantages and learn the techniques. From the Near East, farming spreads west into Europe, south into Egypt and North Africa, and east into Central Asia and eventually to India and China. In the Americas, agriculture develops independently, based on different crops, maize and beans and squash in Mesoamerica, potatoes and quinoa in the Andes. In New Guinea, people are cultivating taro and bananas. In Africa, south of the Sahara, people are growing millet and sorghum. Each region has its own trajectory, its own crops and animals, its own timeline, but the pattern is the same: hunter-gatherers becoming farmers, villages becoming towns, and towns becoming cities. While the Near East is being transformed by agriculture, Europe is still a land of forests and hunter-gatherers, a world that is changing but at its own pace, in its own way. Imagine now that you are standing on the shore of the Baltic Sea, somewhere in what will one day be Denmark or southern Sweden, around 7,000 years ago. The landscape is dominated by dense forests, primarily oak and elm and hazel, with an understory of ferns and brambles so thick that walking through it is difficult. The forests are dark and quiet, filled with the sounds of birds and the occasional crash of a deer moving through the underbrush. And the air smells of damp earth and rotting leaves and the sea. Your people, the Ertebel culture, are the last great hunter-gatherers of Northern Europe. And you live a life that is rich and complex, adapted perfectly to the resources of the forest and the sea. You do not farm, but you are not nomadic either. You live in permanent villages on the coast, clusters of wooden houses built near the mouths of rivers or on sheltered bays, places where the resources of the land and sea come together. The sea provides fish, cod and herring and eel, which you catch with nets and traps and hooks, and seals, which you hunt from boats with harpoons. The estuaries and mudflats provide oysters and mussels and clams, which you gather in enormous quantities, so many that the shells accumulate in great mounds, middens that mark your villages and can be seen from a distance. The forest provides red deer and roe deer and wild boar, which you hunt with bows and spears and with the help of dogs, the first domesticated animal, companions and helpers, who can track game and bring it to bay. The forest also provides hazelnuts, which ripen in the autumn and can be stored for months, and a variety of other nuts and berries and roots. The rivers provide salmon and trout, which swim upstream to spawn in the spring and autumn, and you build elaborate fish weirs, structures of wooden stakes and woven branches that span the river and funnel the fish into traps where they can be easily harvested. These weirs are communal projects, built and maintained by the entire village, and they provide a reliable, abundant source of food that makes it possible to live in one place year-round. Your people have developed a sophisticated material culture, tools and weapons and ornaments that are beautiful as well as functional. You make pottery, simple round-bottomed pots used for cooking and storage, decorated with impressions made by shells or cords pressed into the wet clay before firing. You make stone axes with polished blades, incredibly sharp and durable, used for cutting trees and working wood. You make bone points and fish hooks and harpoons, carved from the antlers of red deer and polished smooth. And you make jewelry, beads and pendants made from shells and amber and animal teeth, worn as necklaces and bracelets, markers of status and identity. The coast is not isolated, but part of a network of trade and exchange that stretches across Northern Europe. Amber, the fossilized resin of ancient trees, is found on the beaches of the Baltic, washed up by the waves, and it is highly valued for its beauty and its supposed magical properties. You trade amber to people far inland, receiving in return high-quality flint from regions where it is abundant, furs from the northern forests, and eventually, pottery and tools from the farming communities that are beginning to spread north from Central Europe. This trade connects you to distant peoples, creates relationships and obligations, and spreads ideas and innovations across vast distances. But the world is changing. From the south, farming is spreading, carried by people who are moving north, clearing the forests, planting their crops, herding their animals. These farmers are different from you, culturally and perhaps genetically, descendants of the Neolithic farmers of the Near East who have spent thousands of years adapting to the life of cultivation. They live in rectangular longhouses, large wooden structures that house entire extended families along with their animals and their stored grain. They clear the land by felling the trees and setting them on fire, creating fields where they plant wheat and barley and peas. They keep cattle and pigs and sheep, and they value milk and meat and wool more than the wild resources of the forest. At first, the contact between your people and the farmers is peaceful, even beneficial. You trade with them, exchanging fish and furs and amber for grain and pottery and domestic animals. Some of your people begin to adopt elements of the farming lifestyle, keeping a few sheep or planting a small patch of grain, while still relying primarily on hunting and gathering. But gradually, the balance shifts. The farmers are more numerous, their population is growing faster because their food supply is more reliable and because farming can support higher population densities than hunting and gathering. They need land, and the land they want is the same land your people have lived on for thousands of years, the forests and the coasts and the river valleys. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming in Northern Europe is not a simple adoption of new techniques, but a replacement of one people by another. Genetic studies of ancient skeletons show that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and the Neolithic farmers were distinct populations, and that over the course of a few thousand years, the hunter-gatherers largely disappear from the genetic record, replaced by people with ancestry from the south. This does not mean that all the hunter-gatherers were killed or driven out. Some intermarried with the farmers, some adopted farming and were absorbed into the farming communities. But as a distinct way of life, as a culture, the hunter-gatherers of Europe vanished, their traditions lost, their languages forgotten, their intimate knowledge of the forest and the sea replaced by the knowledge of plowing and planting and herding. As the forests are cleared and the farms spread, the landscape itself is transformed. The great oak forests that once covered Europe are cut down. The wood used for building and fuel, the land turned into fields and pastures. The megafauna that survived the end of the Ice Age, the aurochs and the wisent and the elk, are hunted to extinction or confined to ever-shrinking refuges. The rivers are altered, dammed and diverted for irrigation, their courses straightened, their floodplains drained and converted to farmland. The world of the hunter-gatherers is disappearing, replaced by a world shaped by human hands, a landscape of fields and fences and villages and roads. But the hunter-gatherers leave behind monuments, structures so massive and so enduring that they still stand today, visible reminders of a world that is gone. These are the megaliths, the great stone monuments of Neolithic Europe, structures like Stonehenge in England, Karnak in France, and Newgrange in Ireland. These monuments are built of enormous stones, some weighing dozens of tons, quarried and transported and erected with nothing but human muscle and ingenuity and simple tools. Their construction would have required the labor of hundreds or even thousands of people, working together for years or decades. And their purpose is still debated. Some are tombs, chambered cairns where the dead were placed along with grave goods, pottery and tools and ornaments. Some are aligned with the solstices or equinoxes, suggesting that they were used for astronomical observations or seasonal rituals. Some seem to be gathering places, communal centers where dispersed populations came together for ceremonies or feasts or trade. Stonehenge, the most famous of these monuments, began as a simple circular ditch and bank, built around 5,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers or early farmers. Over the following centuries, it was elaborated and rebuilt. Massive sarsen stones were transported from quarries 20 miles away. Smaller bluestones were brought from Wales, over 150 miles distant, and the stones were shaped and erected in concentric circles and horseshoe arrangements, creating a structure of astonishing precision and scale. The purpose of Stonehenge is unknown. It may have been a temple, a burial site, an astronomical observatory, or all of these things, but what is clear is that it represented an enormous investment of labor and resources, and that it held deep significance for the people who built it. The megalithic monuments are the final flowering of Neolithic culture in Europe, a demonstration of the organizational capacity and the spiritual complexity of these early farming societies. But they also mark the end of an era. By the time the last stones were erected at Stonehenge, around 4,000 years ago, Europe had been transformed. The forests were largely gone, the hunter-gatherers were gone, and the landscape was dominated by farming communities living in permanent settlements, growing their crops, raising their animals, and beginning to develop the social hierarchies and the technologies that would lead in time to the rise of civilization. The world after the Ice Age was a world of constant change, and the people who could adapt, who could learn new ways of living, who could adopt new technologies and new ideas, were the ones who survived and thrived. Those who could not adapt, who clung to the old ways, were left behind, their cultures fading into memory, their stories lost, their bones buried beneath the fields and cities of their successors. But the warming that followed the last glacial maximum was not smooth or steady. There was a moment, a terrifying moment in the long thaw, when the ice returned. This episode is called The Younger Dryas, and it represents one of the most abrupt and dramatic climate changes in recent geological history, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that lasted for more than 1,000 years and had profound effects on human societies across the northern hemisphere. Imagine that you are living in the Levant around 12,800 years ago, in a Natafean village, enjoying the mild climate and abundant resources that have made sedentary life possible. The wild cereals are growing thickly on the hillsides, the gazelles are migrating through in predictable patterns, and your people have settled into a rhythm of life that seems stable and sustainable. And then within a single generation, everything changes. The winters become colder, longer, harsher than anyone can remember. The rains that used to fall reliably every winter become erratic, some years bringing floods, other years bringing drought. The wild cereals, so abundant just a generation ago, are growing more sparsely, the seed heads smaller, the harvests less reliable. The gazelle herds are thinning, moving away, following the retreating vegetation. The springs and streams that provided water year-round are drying up, and the oak forests are dying back, replaced by grassland and then by scrub. The world is becoming colder and drier, and the easy abundance that allowed your people to settle down is disappearing. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated among scientists. One theory suggests that it was triggered by a massive influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic, possibly from the sudden draining of a glacial lake in North America, Lake Agassiz, which held more water than all the Great Lakes combined. As the ice sheet that dammed the lake melted and shifted, the water, which had been trapped for thousands of years, suddenly burst free, flowing into the ocean in a catastrophic flood. This enormous volume of fresh water would have disrupted the North Atlantic currents, the great conveyor belt of warm water that flows from the tropics to the Arctic and helps keep northern Europe warm. With the currents disrupted, the climate of the northern hemisphere plunged back toward glacial conditions, even as the overall trend of warming continued. Another, more controversial theory suggests that the Younger Dryas was triggered by an extraterrestrial impact, a comet or asteroid that exploded in the atmosphere above North America, creating widespread fires, ejecting dust and debris into the atmosphere and triggering climate cooling. Proponents of this theory point to a layer of sediment found at sites across North America and Europe, dating to the start of the Younger Dryas, that contains unusual concentrations of microscopic diamonds and other materials that could have formed in the heat and pressure of an impact. Critics argue that the evidence is ambiguous and that other explanations are more likely. The debate continues. But what is clear is that the Younger Dryas was a real event, a dramatic and sudden climate reversal, and that it had real consequences for the people who lived through it. The Younger Dryas lasted from roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. 12 centuries of renewed cold in the midst of the warming trend. Glaciers that had been retreating began to advance again, though they never reached the extent of the last glacial maximum. Sea levels, which had been rising, stabilized or even dropped slightly. The forests that had been spreading north retreated, and the open tundra and grassland expanded. For the people living in the affected regions, primarily the northern hemisphere, the Younger Dryas was a crisis, a test of their ability to adapt and survive. In the Levant, the Natufian culture, which had thrived in the warm, wet conditions of the early post-glacial period, struggled to maintain its sedentary lifestyle. The wild resources that had supported permanent villages were no longer sufficient, and people were forced to become more mobile again, abandoning some settlements, moving in search of food and water. But this time they could not simply return to the old hunter-gatherer ways, because the population had grown during the good years, and there were too many people to be supported by hunting and gathering alone. Faced with this crisis, some Natufian communities began to intensify their exploitation of the wild cereals, planting seeds in areas where they would not naturally grow, weeding and protecting the plants, essentially practicing a form of proto-agriculture out of necessity. The Younger Dryas, in this view, was the shock that pushed people over the edge from harvesting wild plants to deliberately cultivating them, from gathering to farming. In Europe, the Younger Dryas brought a return of the reindeer and the mammoth steppe vegetation, and the people adapted by shifting their economies back toward hunting these cold-adapted animals. In North America, the Clovis culture, famous for its distinctive stone spear points, was flourishing just before the Younger Dryas and then largely disappeared during it, possibly due to the combined stresses of climate change and the extinction of the megafauna they hunted. The connection between the Younger Dryas and the megafauna extinctions in North America is complex and still debated, but it is clear that many large animals, mammoths and mastodons, and giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats, went extinct around this time, possibly due to a combination of climate change, habitat loss, and overhunting by humans. The Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began. Around 11,600 years ago, the climate flipped back to warming, and the change was astonishingly rapid, perhaps occurring over the course of just a few decades. Ice cores from Greenland show that temperatures rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in less than 50 years, a rate of change that is almost unimaginable. The glaciers retreated rapidly, the forests expanded, the rains returned, and the world entered the Holocene, the current geological epoch, the warm, stable period that has lasted for the past 11,000 years, and within which all of recorded human history has taken place. The psychological impact of the Younger Dryas on the people who lived through it is impossible to measure, but it must have been profound. They had seen the world warm and become more hospitable. They had adapted to that world, built their lives around it, and then they watched it collapse, watched the cold return, watched their resources disappear, watched their way of life threatened. And then, just as suddenly, the warmth returned, and the world became stable again. This experience of dramatic, unpredictable climate change may have shaped their worldview, their sense of the fragility of existence, their understanding that the world is not fixed but subject to forces beyond human control. It may have reinforced the importance of community, of cooperation, of developing technologies and strategies that could buffer against uncertainty. And it may have been one of the factors that drove the adoption of agriculture, the creation of food surplus, the building of permanent settlements, all strategies to insulate human societies from the vagaries of nature, to create a sense of security and control in a world that had proven itself capable of terrifying change. The rising seas at the end of the Ice Age did more than drown coastal lands. They also severed connections between continents, isolating populations that had been in contact for thousands of years, and setting them on independent evolutionary and cultural paths. The most dramatic of these separations was the closing of Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia to the Americas, during the last glacial maximum. Beringia was a vast treeless plain, perhaps 1,000 miles wide, stretching from Siberia to Alaska. It was not a barren wasteland, but a productive grassland, home to mammoths and bison and caribou, and the people who hunted them. These people, the ancestors of all Native Americans, crossed Beringia in waves over thousands of years, moving east from Asia into the unoccupied lands of the Americas. And then as the ice melted and the sea rose, the land bridge disappeared beneath the waves, and the connection was lost. Imagine that you are one of the last people to cross Beringia before it is drowned, part of a small band moving east, following the herds, not knowing that you are leaving one continent for another. The journey is slow and difficult, the land is cold and windy, the resources are scattered, and you must constantly move to find food and shelter. But gradually, you make your way across, and you find yourself in a new land, a land that stretches before you in unimaginable vastness, empty of people, but filled with animals. Great herds of bison and mammoth and horses, predators like lions and dire wolves and short-faced bears, and a landscape of mountains and forests and grasslands that seems to go on forever. This is Alaska, and beyond it lies the rest of the Americas, two continents waiting to be explored and settled. The peopling of the Americas is one of the great human migrations, a movement that took perhaps only a few thousand years, astonishingly rapid on a geological timescale. As people spread from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, adapting to every conceivable environment, from the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the deserts of the Southwest, from the rainforests of the Amazon to the windswept plains of Patagonia. The speed of this expansion is evidenced by the archaeological record. The oldest human sites in Alaska date to around 15,000 years ago, and by 13,000 years ago, people had already reached the southern tip of South America, a distance of over 10,000 miles. The Clovis culture, named for the distinctive stone points first found near Clovis, New Mexico, represents one of the most widespread and successful of the early American cultures. Clovis points are beautifully made, fluted spear points with a distinctive groove running up the center, a design that required great skill to produce and that was incredibly effective for hunting large game. Clovis points have been found across North America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from Canada to Mexico, always in association with the bones of extinct megafauna, mammoths and mastodons and giant bison, evidence that the Clovis people were skilled and successful hunters of these animals. But the megafauna of the Americas, unlike those of Africa and Eurasia, had never encountered humans before, had never evolved the wariness and the defensive strategies that make African elephants so difficult to hunt, and they were vulnerable. Within a few thousand years of the arrival of humans, most of the large animals of the Americas were extinct: mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths and glyptodons, camels and horses and saber-toothed cats, all gone. The causes of these extinctions are debated. Climate change played a role, but human hunting, combined with the rapid arrival of people in an ecosystem that had never known human predation, was likely a major factor. With the extinction of the megafauna, the cultures that had depended on them had to adapt. The Clovis culture fades from the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago, replaced by a diversity of regional cultures, each adapted to its particular environment and resources. In the Arctic, people developed sophisticated technologies for hunting seals and walruses and whales, using harpoons and boats and warm, waterproof clothing made from seal skins. On the Great Plains, people hunted the surviving bison herds, driving them over cliffs or into corrals, butchering them communally and using every part of the animal. In the Pacific Northwest, people exploited the rich marine resources, salmon and shellfish and sea mammals, living in large, permanent villages supported by the abundance of the sea. In the eastern woodlands, people began to cultivate native plants, squash and sunflowers, and eventually maize, which was domesticated in Mesoamerica and spread north over thousands of years. And in Mesoamerica and the Andes, people developed complex agricultural systems, building terraces and irrigation canals, domesticating a wide variety of crops, and eventually creating some of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. But all of this happened in isolation. After Beringia was drowned around 11,000 years ago, the Americas were cut off from the rest of the world. There was no contact with Europe or Africa or Asia, no exchange of ideas or technologies or crops or diseases. For more than 10,000 years, the people of the Americas developed independently, inventing agriculture independently, creating cities and writing and monumental architecture independently. And when Europeans finally arrived in the 15th century, they found a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. Civilizations as complex as their own, but built on different foundations, with different crops and different animals and different gods. Other parts of the world were also isolated by the rising seas. Tasmania, the island off the southern coast of Australia, was connected to the mainland during the last glacial maximum, and people crossed the land bridge and settled there at least 35,000 years ago. But as the sea rose, the connection was severed, and the Tasmanian people were isolated for 10,000 years, the longest period of isolation of any human population in history. During that time, they lost contact with the innovations happening on the mainland. They never developed the boomerang or the spear thrower. They stopped making bone tools, and their toolkit became simpler, more basic. When Europeans arrived in Tasmania in the 18th century, they found a people living in what seemed to be a Stone Age lifestyle. But this was not because the Tasmanians were primitive, but because they had been isolated, and because their population, never more than a few thousand people, was too small to maintain the full range of knowledge and technologies that larger populations can sustain. The isolation of Tasmania is a reminder that human culture is not something innate or inevitable, but something that must be constantly maintained and transmitted, and that small isolated populations are vulnerable to losing knowledge over time. The Pacific Islands were also settled in waves as sea levels rose and fell, with people using boats to reach islands that were never connected to the mainland. The Austronesian expansion, one of the great maritime migrations of prehistory, saw people from Taiwan and Southeast Asia spreading across the Pacific, reaching the Philippines, Indonesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, eventually settling on every habitable island from Madagascar to Easter Island, a vast oceanic world spanning half the globe. This expansion began around 5,000 years ago and continued for thousands of years, with each generation pushing further into the unknown, navigating by the stars and the waves and the birds, carrying with them their crops and their animals and their culture, adapting to each new island, and creating the diverse Polynesian cultures that Europeans would encounter centuries later. The isolation of these populations, whether by rising seas or vast distances, created a world of cultural diversity, thousands of distinct languages and traditions and ways of life, each shaped by its particular environment and history. But it also created vulnerability, because isolated populations, especially small ones, are less resilient to shocks, to diseases, or climate changes or invasions. And when contact was finally re-established, when Europeans began to explore the world in the 15th and 16th centuries, bringing with them diseases to which isolated populations had no immunity, the results were often catastrophic. By 5,000 years ago, the world that had emerged from the melting ice was fully transformed. The climate had stabilized into the warm, relatively predictable pattern of the Holocene, the interglacial period in which we still live. The landscape had been reshaped, forests covering the continents where ice sheets once stood, seas and coastlines finding their modern configurations, and human societies, once small bands of hunters moving across an empty world, had grown and diversified and settled, and in a few key locations, they had begun to build something entirely new. These were the first civilizations, complex societies with cities and writing and organized religion and governments, built on the agricultural surplus created by farming and made possible by the stable climate of the post-glacial world. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers in what is now Iraq, the world's first cities were rising. Uruk, founded around 6,000 years ago, was a city of perhaps 50,000 people at its peak, a massive concentration of humanity unprecedented in history. The city was built of mud brick, the only building material available in a region with little stone or wood, and it was dominated by great temples, ziggurats, stepped pyramids dedicated to the gods. The largest of these, the White Temple, stood on a platform 40 feet high, visible from miles away, a symbol of the city's power and the devotion of its people. Uruk was not just a religious center, but a commercial and administrative one, the hub of a network of trade routes that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, bringing in raw materials that the region lacked: timber from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The people of Uruk developed writing, one of the most important inventions in human history, not for poetry or literature, but for the mundane purposes of administration and trade. The earliest writing, called cuneiform, consisted of simple pictograms pressed into soft clay tablets with a reed stylus, representing not words but things: a jar of oil, a quantity of grain, a number of sheep. These tablets were records of transactions, receipts and invoices and contracts, evidence of an economy that was too complex to be managed by memory alone. Over time, the pictograms became more abstract, representing sounds as well as things, and the system evolved into a full writing system capable of recording anything that could be spoken. With writing came the possibility of preserving knowledge across generations, of recording laws and histories and religious texts, and of creating a literate class of scribes who could read and write, and who formed the backbone of the bureaucracy that ran the city. Mesopotamian society was hierarchical and stratified, divided into classes with different rights and obligations. At the top were the king and the priests, who claimed divine authority and controlled the temples and the surplus they produced. Below them were the merchants and the artisans, people who made their living through trade and specialized crafts, pottery, and metalworking and weaving. And at the bottom were the farmers and the laborers, the vast majority of the population, who worked the fields and built the temples and paid taxes in the form of grain and labor. There were also slaves, people captured in war or enslaved for debt, who had no rights and who could be bought and sold like property. This hierarchy was justified by religion, by the belief that the gods had ordained the social order and that the king was their representative on earth, chosen to rule and to maintain the cosmic balance. In Egypt, a similar process was unfolding along the Nile River. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt, a river that flooded predictably every year, depositing a layer of rich silt on the fields and making agriculture incredibly productive. The early Egyptians learned to harness this flooding, building dikes and canals to control the water and to extend the area that could be irrigated, and the surplus they produced supported a growing population and an increasingly complex society. Around 5,000 years ago, Egypt was unified under a single ruler, the pharaoh, who claimed to be a living god, the incarnation of Horus on earth, and the son of Ra, the sun god. The unification of Egypt created one of the most stable and long-lasting civilizations in history, a society that endured for 3,000 years, largely unchanged in its basic structure and beliefs. The pyramids, the most iconic symbols of ancient Egypt, were built as tombs for the pharaohs, massive structures designed to ensure their safe passage to the afterlife. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 4,500 years ago, is the largest stone structure ever built, consisting of more than 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, fitted together with astonishing precision. The construction of the pyramids required the labor of tens of thousands of workers, organized and fed and housed by a bureaucracy that could plan and execute projects on an unimaginable scale. The pyramids were not built by slaves, as is often imagined, but by free laborers, farmers who worked on the pyramids during the flood season, when their fields were underwater, and who were paid in food and beer, and the knowledge that they were contributing to a project that would last for eternity. In the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, another civilization was emerging, less well known than Mesopotamia or Egypt, but no less impressive: the Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization. flourished from around 4,500 to 3,500 years ago, and at its peak it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. The cities of the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and dozens of others, were remarkably well planned, with grid layouts, straight streets, standardized brick sizes, and sophisticated drainage systems that carried waste away from the living areas. The houses were built of baked brick, with flat roofs and interior courtyards, and many had private bathrooms with drains that connected to the city's sewage system, a level of urban sanitation that would not be matched in Europe for thousands of years. The Indus Valley civilization had writing, a script that appears on thousands of seals and pottery fragments, but it has never been deciphered, and the language it represents is unknown. This is one of the great mysteries of archaeology, a civilization that was literate and sophisticated, but whose words we cannot read and whose history remains largely unknown. What is clear from the archaeological evidence is that the Indus Valley cities were centers of trade, connected by sea to Mesopotamia and by land to Central Asia, importing raw materials and exporting finished goods, cotton textiles and beads and metalwork. The civilization seems to have been egalitarian compared to its contemporaries, with little evidence of palaces or temples or the extreme wealth disparities seen in Egypt or Mesopotamia, but this may simply reflect the limits of our knowledge. In China, along the Yellow River, the foundations of Chinese civilization were being laid. The Yangshao culture and the Longshan culture, dating to around 7,000 to 4,000 years ago, were farming societies that grew millet and kept pigs and made elaborate pottery, often decorated with geometric patterns or images of animals and humans. These cultures developed into the first Chinese dynasties, the Xia and the Shang, which are recorded in later Chinese historical texts, but which archaeology has only partially confirmed. The Shang dynasty, which ruled from around 3,600 to 3,000 years ago, had writing, a script carved on oracle bones, pieces of turtle shell or ox bone that were heated until they cracked, and then interpreted by diviners as messages from the ancestors. This script is the direct ancestor of modern Chinese characters, making it the oldest continuously used writing system in the world. All of these civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley and China, along with other early civilizations in Mesoamerica and the Andes, share certain features. They are all based on agriculture, on the cultivation of a few key crops, wheat and barley in the Near East, rice and millet in China, maize and beans in Mesoamerica. They all developed in river valleys or coastal areas where water was abundant and soil was fertile. They all have cities, concentrations of population that could not be supported by local resources alone, but that drew on the surplus produced by the surrounding countryside. They all have social hierarchies, with ruling elites who control the surplus and who use it to support armies and bureaucracies and monumental building projects. They all have writing or other systems for recording information, essential for managing the complexity of a large society. And they all have organized religion, with temples and priests and elaborate rituals, a way of explaining the world and legitimating the social order and binding the community together through shared beliefs and practices. But these civilizations were fragile, dependent on the continuation of the stable climate that had allowed them to develop. A prolonged drought, a shift in river courses, a series of bad harvests could undermine the agricultural surplus that supported the cities and the elites, leading to famine and unrest and collapse. The Indus Valley civilization declined and eventually disappeared around 3,500 years ago, possibly due to climate change that reduced the monsoon rains and dried up the rivers. The Old Kingdom of Egypt collapsed around 4,200 years ago, partly due to a series of low Nile floods that reduced agricultural productivity and undermined the authority of the pharaohs. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean, including the Mycenaeans and the Hittites, collapsed around 3,200 years ago in a period of chaos and destruction that is still not fully understood, but that may have been triggered by drought and famine and mass migrations of displaced peoples. The lesson of these collapses is that civilization is not inevitable or permanent, but contingent, dependent on favorable environmental conditions and on the ability of societies to adapt to change. The stable climate of the Holocene made civilization possible, but it did not guarantee its survival, and the societies that thrived were those that could manage their resources wisely, that could adapt to environmental shocks, and that could maintain social cohesion in the face of stress. The world that emerged from the melting ice was a world of opportunity, but it was also a world of risk, and the human story from the end of the Ice Age to the present is a story of constant adaptation, of societies rising and falling, of knowledge gained and lost, of civilizations that reached astonishing heights and then collapsed into ruin, leaving behind only their monuments and their myths. And so we come to the end of our journey through the world after the ice. A world transformed by forces beyond human control but shaped, ultimately, by human ingenuity and adaptability and resilience. The melting of the glaciers at the end of the last ice age was not a single event but a process that unfolded over thousands of years. A gradual warming punctuated by sudden shifts and reversals. A transformation that reshaped the continents and the seas and the very climate of the Earth. The ice that had covered a third of the land surface slowly retreated, revealing landscapes that had been hidden for 100,000 years, and as the ice melted, the sea rose, drowning coastal plains and creating the coastlines we know today. The tundra and the mammoth steppe gave way to forests and grasslands, and the animals that had thrived in the cold, the mammoths and the woolly rhinos and the cave lions, slowly disappeared, replaced by species better suited to the warming world. Human beings, who had survived the Ice Age as mobile hunters living in small bands, adapted to the changing world with remarkable creativity. They developed new technologies, the bow and arrow, fishing equipment, boats, pottery, and eventually agriculture, learning to cultivate plants and domesticate animals, and to live in permanent settlements. These adaptations allowed them to exploit the resources of the post-glacial world with increasing efficiency, to support larger populations, to accumulate surplus, and eventually to build cities and states and all the complex institutions that we associate with civilization. The transition from the Ice Age to the modern world is the story of how human societies moved from the margins of survival to a position of unprecedented dominance over the natural world, a transformation that began with the melting of the ice and that continues to this day. The Holocene, the geological epoch that began when the ice finally melted for the last time, around 11,600 years ago, has been a period of unusual climate stability, a warm interglacial that has lasted longer than most previous interglacials, and that has provided the stable environmental conditions necessary for the development of agriculture and civilization. For 11,000 years, the climate has been relatively predictable, the seasons have followed a regular pattern, and the major weather systems have remained largely in the same positions. This stability is not normal in the long history of the Earth, which has experienced dramatic climate swings, ice ages and warm periods and everything in between. But it is the only climate that modern humans have ever known, the only climate that civilization has ever experienced. The world we live in today, with its 7 billion people and its cities and its farms and its technologies, is a direct product of the stable Holocene climate. Agriculture, which supports almost all human life, is only possible because the climate is predictable enough that farmers can plan what to plant and when to plant it, knowing with reasonable certainty what the weather will be like in the months to come. Cities which concentrate populations far beyond what local resources can support are only possible because of the transportation networks that can reliably bring in food and other necessities, networks that depend on climate stability. The entire structure of modern civilization, from global trade to political boundaries to cultural practices, has been built around the assumption that the climate will remain more or less as it is, and this assumption, which has been valid for 11,000 years, is now being tested. What was lost when the ice melted? The megafauna of the Ice Age, the mammoths and the mastodons and the giant ground sloths and the saber-toothed cats are gone, driven to extinction by a combination of climate change and human hunting. These animals, which had dominated the landscape for millions of years, disappeared within a few thousand years of the end of the Ice Age, and the ecosystems they inhabited were fundamentally altered. The mammoth steppe, the vast grassland that stretched from Europe to North America, vanished as well, replaced by forests and tundra, and the unique combination of species that made up that ecosystem, from the smallest plants to the largest predators, can never be recreated. The landscapes that were drowned by the rising seas, Doggerland and Sunderland and Beringia, took with them the human stories and the cultures that had developed there, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and the faint echoes of flood myths. What was gained? The stable climate that allowed for agriculture, the food surplus that allowed for cities, the leisure time that allowed for art and science and philosophy. All of these are products of the world after the ice, the diversity of human cultures, the thousands of languages and traditions and ways of life that exist today all developed in the post-glacial world, shaped by the particular environments and resources available in different regions. The technologies that we take for granted, from writing to metalworking to complex mathematics, were all invented by people living in the Holocene, building on the foundations laid by their Ice Age ancestors, but taking advantage of the opportunities provided by a more hospitable world. The story of the world after the ice is also a story of climate as destiny, of the profound ways in which the physical environment shapes human societies and human history. The people who lived through the end of the Ice Age did not understand the forces that were changing their world. They did not know about Milankovitch cycles or ocean currents or greenhouse gases, but they experienced the effects of those forces directly, in the melting glaciers and the rising seas and the changing weather, and they had to adapt or perish. The choices they made, to follow the herds or to settle down, to continue hunting or to start farming, to stay or to migrate, were constrained by the environment they lived in, and those choices shaped the trajectory of human history. The rise of civilization in the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley and the Indus Valley and the Yellow River was not inevitable, but contingent, dependent on the presence of domesticable plants and animals and favorable climates and stable rivers. And it is no coincidence that these civilizations all arose in similar environments, in river valleys in temperate or subtropical regions where the conditions for agriculture were optimal. As we stand here, at the beginning of the 21st century, we are living in a world that is once again changing, not because of natural cycles, but because of human activity, the burning of fossil fuels, and the clearing of forests, and the release of greenhouse gases that are warming the planet. The climate that has been stable for 11,000 years is becoming less stable. The glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, the weather patterns are shifting, and the world is entering a new period of uncertainty. The changes we are experiencing now are happening faster than the changes at the end of the Ice Age, on a timescale of decades rather than millennia, and they are happening to a world that is far more densely populated and far more dependent on complex systems of agriculture and trade and infrastructure. The story of the world after the ice is a reminder that climate shapes human destiny, that our societies are built on environmental foundations, and that when those foundations shift, we must adapt or collapse. The people of the Ice Age adapted. They survived the melting of the glaciers and the rising of the seas and the transformation of their world, and they built new societies in the new landscapes that emerged. They had the advantage of time, thousands of years to adjust to the changes, and they had the advantage of low population densities, which meant that migration was always an option. There was always somewhere else to go. We do not have those advantages. The changes we face are happening much faster, and we live in a world that is already full, where migration is difficult, and where the systems that support us are fragile and interconnected. But we also have advantages that the Ice Age people did not have. We have knowledge and technology, and the ability to understand the forces that are changing our world, and to make conscious choices about how to respond. The world after the ice is the world we inhabit, a world built on melted glaciers, a world shaped by climate and geography, and the slow accumulation of human knowledge and innovation. It is a world of astonishing diversity and complexity, a world where 7 billion people live in environments ranging from the Arctic tundra to the Sahara Desert, to the rainforests of the Amazon, all descendants of the small bands of hunters who survived the Ice Age and adapted to the changing world. It is a world of cities and farms and technologies that would be unrecognizable to those Ice Age ancestors, but it is also a world that still bears the marks of the ice in the lakes carved by glaciers, in the coastlines shaped by rising seas, in the soils and the forests and the rivers that were all created by the melting of the ice and the warming of the climate. And so our story of the world after the ice comes to a close. We have journeyed from the frozen tundra of the last glacial maximum, to the green grasslands of the Sahara, from the drowned lands of Doggerland, to the first cities of Mesopotamia, following the thread of human adaptation and survival through thousands of years of change. We have seen how the melting of the ice reshaped the continents, how the rising seas drowned ancient lands, how new forests and grasslands emerged, and how human beings, with all their ingenuity and resilience, adapted to each change, developing new technologies, new social structures, new ways of understanding and living in the world. The ice has melted, the world has warmed, and we are the inheritors of that transformation, living in the stable Holocene climate, that made civilization possible, but facing now a new period of change that will test our ability to adapt once more. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the deep past, through a world of ice and warmth, of extinction and innovation, of landscapes lost and civilizations born. The story of the world after the ice is our story, the foundation of everything we are and everything we have become. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let your mind wander through those ancient landscapes. Imagine the sound of glaciers carving into the sea, the sight of mammoths moving across the tundra, the feel of standing on the shore of Doggerland as the waves slowly reclaim the land. Dream of the green Sahara and the first fields of wheat, of boats on rising seas, and the building of the first cities. These are not just ancient stories, but the echoes of the world that shaped us, the deep history that flows through our veins and whispers in our blood. Sleep well, and dream of melting ice and rising seas, of ancestors who survived and adapted and built the world we know. Until our next journey into the past, rest peacefully, and remember that we are all children of the ice, inheritors of its melting, living in the world it left behind.